The moment David smashed the ceramic dinner plate against my head while screaming at me to obey his mother, I felt something more than pain. I felt the final thread of denial snap inside my chest. Blood trickled down my temple as Patricia stood in our marble entryway, arms crossed, watching her son assault me with the kind of cold satisfaction that made my stomach turn. 8 years I had poured into building our life in that Paradise Valley mansion. 8 years of my interior design empire funding their lavish lifestyle. And in that single violent moment, standing in the home I had paid for, I realized I wasn't just leaving a marriage. I was reclaiming everything they had tried to steal from me, starting with the $7.5 million estate they assumed would always be theirs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Foster, and this is the story of how I stopped being the woman they thought they could control. The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly over Paradise Valley the morning everything still felt possible. I remember standing on the terrace of our mansion, watching the light turn the desert mountains into shades of copper and gold, believing I had built something permanent. The house sprawled across 2 acres of pristine desert landscape, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the boundary between inside and outside feel like a gentle suggestion rather than a wall. I had designed every inch of it myself, from the travertine floors that stayed cool even in summer to the custom ironwork that framed the courtyard fountain. That fountain had been my vision entirely. I sketched it on a napkin during our 2nd year of marriage, back when David still looked at me like I hung the moon instead of like I was an obstacle to his mother's expectations. The water feature cost $40,000 to install, with hand-carved stone imported from a quarry outside Sedona. David complained about the expense, but I paid for it out of my own accounts, just like I paid for almost everything that made our house a home instead of just an address. My interior design firm, Foster Collective, had grown from a small consultation business into one of the most sought-after design houses in Scottsdale. We handled estates throughout Paradise Valley, Silverleaf, and Desert Mountain. Clients flew me to their vacation properties in Carmel and Telluride. My work had been featured in Architectural Digest twice. The business generated revenue that most people only dreamed about, and for years I convinced myself that sharing that success with David was what marriage meant. Every morning followed the same careful rhythm. I woke at 5:30, before the heat settled over the valley like a wool blanket. I brewed coffee in the kitchen with its custom Italian marble countertops that I had selected myself during a trip to Carrara. The espresso machine was a gift I had bought for David's birthday 3 years ago, something he never learned to use because he preferred I make his cappuccino exactly the way he liked it. I would prepare his breakfast, coordinate with our housekeeper about the day's tasks, review project proposals for the firm, and make sure everything in our immaculate home reflected the image of success David wanted to project to his mother and their social circle. David worked in commercial real estate development, or at least that was the story we told people. The truth was murkier. His family had built their wealth 2 generations back through land deals and strip mall developments across the Phoenix metro area. By the time David came along, the heavy lifting was done. His role consisted mainly of attending meetings his father had arranged, signing documents prepared by the family attorneys, and networking at the country club his mother treated like her personal kingdom. The actual income from his work was modest compared to what I generated, but admitting that would have shattered the Foster family narrative about their son's business acumen. I covered the gaps quietly. The mortgage on our mansion, nearly $12,000 monthly, came from my accounts. The property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance for the pool and landscaping, all of it filtered through my business or personal funds. When David wanted to lease a new Range Rover, I made it happen. When Patricia insisted we join her exclusive country club with its $60,000 initiation fee, I wrote the check. Every designer suit David wore, every golf trip to Pebble Beach, every bottle of wine he brought to impress his mother's dinner guests, I funded it all. But I told myself it was an investment in our partnership. I convinced myself that his family's connections opened doors for my business. I believed the lie that a successful marriage meant erasing the scoreboard and simply giving without counting. The first crack in that belief appeared on a Tuesday evening in late spring. I had just returned from a consultation in Silverleaf, exhausted from presenting 3 different design concepts to a client who could not decide between contemporary desert modern and territorial revival style. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet that made the valley look like it was on fire. I walked into our home expecting the usual quiet, but instead found Patricia sitting in my living room as if she owned the place. She did not knock. She never knocked. David had given his mother a key to our house within the first month of our marriage, and she wielded that access like a weapon. Patricia Foster was a woman who had built her entire identity around control, from her rigidly maintained platinum hair to her wardrobe of St. John knit suits in various shades of cream and taupe. She had opinions about everything, delivered with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, and she expected those opinions to be treated as commandments. That evening she sat on my custom velvet sofa, the one I had agonized over for weeks before selecting the perfect shade of sage green, and she was rearranging the decorative objects on my coffee table. The Murano glass piece I had purchased during a trip to Venice was now pushed to the side, replaced by a garish crystal bowl she must have brought from her own home. I stood in the doorway, briefcase still in hand, trying to process the invasion. Patricia looked up with that thin smile, and informed me that she had taken the liberty of improving the living room arrangement. She said my aesthetic was too cold, too minimal, and that a proper home needed warmth and traditional elegance. The words were phrased as helpful suggestions, but the subtext was clear. My taste was wrong. My choices were inadequate, and she had every right to correct them. David emerged from his office as I started to respond. I expected him to defend our space, to gently remind his mother that this was our home and I was a professional designer who understood aesthetics better than most. Instead, he placed a hand on my shoulder and suggested I hear her out. He said his mother had excellent taste, and that perhaps I was being too sensitive about creative differences. That was the first time I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Not enough to knock me over, but enough to make me question my balance. I let it go. I told myself it was one incident, one intrusion, one moment of poor judgment on David's part. I removed Patricia's crystal bowl after she left and put my Murano glass back in its proper position, and I convinced myself the boundary had been reset. But boundaries, I would learn, meant nothing to Patricia Foster. And my husband had no intention of ever enforcing them. The intrusions multiplied with a casual relentlessness that made them hard to fight. Patricia began appearing at the house 2 or 3 times a week, always unannounced, always with some new project or correction she felt compelled to implement. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets because she did not approve of how I organized my serving platters. She brought her own throw pillows to replace the ones I had carefully selected to complement the room's color palette. She hired a different landscaping company without consulting me, because she felt the desert plants I had chosen looked too sparse. Each time I objected, David mediated with the same infuriating diplomacy. He would acknowledge my feelings, then explain his mother's perspective, and ultimately suggest I compromise for the sake of family harmony. It was a master class in invalidation, performed with such smoothness that I sometimes wondered if I was overreacting. Maybe I was being too rigid. Maybe sharing our space with his mother was just part of being married into a close family. Maybe my need for autonomy was actually selfishness. The gaslighting was so gradual I did not recognize it as abuse. It felt like a series of small concessions, each one justified by appeals to tradition, family values, and the greater good of our marriage. But each concession carved away a piece of my authority in my own home, until I started asking permission for decisions that should have been mine alone. I began noticing changes in David too, shifts in behavior so subtle they could have been mistaken for stress or distraction. He started coming home later, usually after I had already eaten dinner alone at our 10-person dining table. He claimed the delays were work-related, last-minute meetings that ran long, client dinners that could not be rescheduled. But commercial real estate development did not typically require someone to return home smelling faintly of perfume that was not mine, or to guard his phone with sudden paranoia. One night in early summer, when the temperature still hovered in the 90s well after sunset, I asked David directly if something was wrong. We were in our bedroom, a space I had designed as a sanctuary with soft gray walls and blackout curtains that kept out the relentless Arizona sun. He was getting ready for bed, and I caught him smiling at his phone screen before quickly locking it and setting it face down on the nightstand. When I questioned the secrecy, he laughed it off. He said I was imagining things, that work emails were confidential and I would not understand the context anyway. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then he turned the accusation back on me, suggesting I was becoming paranoid and controlling. He said his mother had mentioned I seemed stressed lately, that perhaps I was working too hard and letting my imagination run wild. The deflection was so smooth I almost accepted it. Almost. But something in my gut refused to let go. I started paying closer attention, not obsessively, but with the kind of focus I brought to my design work when a space did not feel quite right and I needed to identify the problem. The evidence accumulated slowly. A receipt for dinner at a restaurant we had never visited together, tucked into his wallet when I was looking for cash to tip our housekeeper. A new cologne that appeared in his bathroom, something woody and expensive that I had not purchased for him. Texts that made his phone buzz at odd hours. Messages he would glance at and then dismiss without comment. And through it all, Patricia's presence in our home intensified, her visits becoming longer and more intrusive, her suggestions turning into demands that David expected me to accommodate without protest. By mid-July, the temperature outside regularly exceeded 110 degrees, and the atmosphere inside our mansion felt just as oppressive. I moved through my own home like a guest, second-guessing every choice, wondering when Patricia would appear to criticize my decisions, waiting for David to come home and find new ways to make me feel like I was failing at being the wife his mother expected. I discovered the first undeniable proof on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, during what should have been a routine stop at our bank. I had gone to make a deposit for the design firm, one of those ordinary errands that filled the spaces between client meetings and site visits. The bank manager, a woman named Helen who had handled my business accounts for 5 years, greeted me with her usual warmth, and then hesitated before asking if I wanted to review the recent activity on our joint household account. Something in her tone made me pause. Helen had that carefully neutral expression people, where when they know something uncomfortable, and are not sure whether to share it. I told her yes, expecting to see the usual charges for groceries, utilities, maybe another impulse purchase David had made without mentioning it. Instead, I found myself staring at a pattern of withdrawals that made my throat tighten. $500 at a jewelry store in Old Town Scottsdale. $800 at a boutique hotel in Sedona. $1,000 at a high-end restaurant I had never heard of. Charged on a Saturday evening when David told me he was playing golf with clients. The dates stretched back 3 months, each withdrawal carefully timed for days when I was traveling for work or occupied with major design projects that kept me at job sites from dawn until well after dark. Helen watched my face carefully as I scrolled through the statements on her computer screen. She did not offer commentary, but her silence felt louder than words. I asked her to print everything from the past 6 months. The stack of paper she handed me was thick enough to feel heavy in my hands. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot with the air conditioning blasting, reading through every transaction with the kind of methodical focus I usually reserved for construction budgets. The spending pattern was unmistakable. David had been living a separate life, one funded entirely by our joint account, which meant funded entirely by me since my income was the only substantial money flowing into it. Every romantic dinner, every weekend getaway, every piece of jewelry I had unknowingly paid for all of it. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and opened our credit card accounts. I had not checked them in months, trusting that David was managing his own spending responsibly. That trust dissolved as I saw charge after charge at luxury retailers, spas, wine bars, and boutique hotels. One entry stopped me cold. A charge for $2,000 at a resort in Carefree, a small wealthy enclave north of Scottsdale, dated exactly 3 weeks ago. The same weekend David told me he was attending a real estate conference in Tucson. I sat there in the parking lot, heat radiating off the asphalt in visible waves, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This was not paranoia. This was not stress making me imagine problems. This was calculated deception, executed with enough care to avoid detection but not enough discipline to hide the financial trail. The next discovery came that same evening, almost like the universe had decided I was ready to see the full picture. I arrived home to find Patricia already there, as usual, but this time she had brought her interior decorator, a prissy man named Gerald who spoke about window treatments with the gravity of a cardiac surgeon discussing transplant procedures. They were standing in my living room, examining my curtains with expressions of barely concealed disdain. Patricia announced, not asked, that she had decided my window treatments were too modern and stark. She wanted something more traditional, more elegant, more in keeping with what she called appropriate taste for a home of this caliber. Gerald was already taking measurements, discussing fabric options with Patricia as if I were not standing right there. As if this were not my house, designed with my expertise, paid for with my money. I felt heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. For the first time in our marriage, I did not modulate my tone or choose diplomatic words. I told Gerald to stop. I informed Patricia that no changes would be made to my home without my explicit approval. I said it clearly, firmly, without apology. Patricia's expression froze into something between shock and rage. She turned to me with that brittle smile and said that David had already approved the changes. She suggested I was being difficult for no reason, that I clearly did not appreciate her efforts to help improve our home. Before I could respond, David appeared from his office, drawn by the tension in raised voices. I expected him to support me. After everything, after years of putting his mother's feelings before mine, I thought perhaps this blatant overstep would finally make him see reason. Instead, he pulled me aside and asked me to calm down. He said his mother was only trying to help, that I was overreacting, and that we could discuss the window treatments later like rational adults. Something in me cracked wide open. I held up my phone, still displaying the bank statements I had pulled up during my drive home. I asked David point blank about the charges in Sedona, the boutique hotel, the jewelry store, the resort in Carefree. I watched his face cycle through surprise, then calculation, then a defensive anger that confirmed everything I needed to know. He tried to dismiss it. He said those charges were work-related, client entertainment, business expenses I would not understand. When I pointed out that the hotel in Sedona was booked for a weekend and listed 2 guests, he shifted tactics. He accused me of spying on him, invading his privacy, acting like a paranoid, jealous wife instead of a partner who trusted him. Patricia inserted herself into the argument with the precision of someone who had been waiting for this moment. She told me that I had always been too controlling, too focused on my career, too unwilling to prioritize David's needs. She said that perhaps if I had been a better wife, more attentive and less obsessed with my business, David would not feel the need to seek appreciation elsewhere. The words hit like physical blows. I stood in my own living room, in the house I had designed and paid for, and listened to my husband's mother blame me for his infidelity while he stood silent beside her. He did not defend me. He did not contradict her. His silence was agreement, and that hurt worse than any accusation. I walked out of the room before I said something I could not take back. I grabbed my car keys and drove with no destination in mind, just a desperate need to breathe air that did not feel poisonous. I ended up at my best friend Nicole's house in Old Town, showing up unannounced with bank statements clutched in my hands and tears I had been holding back finally breaking free. Nicole Grant had been my friend since college, one of those rare people who saw through pretense and loved you anyway. She worked as a victim advocate, helping women navigate domestic violence situations, and she took one look at my face and pulled me inside without questions. We sat on her back patio under string lights, and I told her everything. The financial evidence, Patricia's escalating intrusions, David's gaslighting, the window treatment confrontation, all of it spilled out in a torrent I could not control. Nicole listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, she said something that changed everything. She told me that what I was describing was not just a bad marriage. It was financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and a pattern of control that would only escalate. She said I needed to protect myself legally and financially before David and Patricia realized I was done playing by their rules. The thought terrified me. Divorce meant admitting failure, destroying the image of success I had worked so hard to project, facing the judgment of people who would assume I had done something to drive my husband away. But staying meant accepting a life where I existed to fund David's lifestyle and endure Patricia's contempt. When Nicole framed it that way, the choice became clear even though it hurt like pulling out my own bones. That night I slept in Nicole's guest room, and the next morning I began making calls. The first was to Richard Brennan, a divorce attorney whose reputation in Scottsdale was legendary. He specialized in high-asset divorces, and his track record of protecting his clients' interests was exactly what I needed. His assistant scheduled me for a consultation that same afternoon, flagging it as urgent after I briefly explained my situation. Richard's office occupied the top floor of a sleek building in downtown Phoenix, all glass and steel with views that stretched across the valley. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair, and the kind of calm authority that came from decades of seeing every possible variation of marital dissolution. I sat across from his desk and laid out the evidence I had gathered, the bank statements, the credit card charges, the pattern of deception and financial exploitation. Richard reviewed everything with the careful attention of someone reading a contract for loopholes. When he looked up, his expression was serious but not unkind. He told me that Arizona was a community property state, which meant that everything acquired during the marriage was presumed to belong equally to both spouses. However, he said there were exceptions and strategies we could employ, especially given that I had clear documentation of being the primary financial contributor. He asked pointed questions about the house. Who paid the down payment? Whose income covered the mortgage? Were there any prenuptial agreements? I explained that I had paid the entire down payment, $750,000 from my business accounts. I had covered every mortgage payment for the 8 years we had lived there. My name was on the deed alongside David's, but my money had purchased and maintained every square foot of the property. Richard made notes with a fountain pen, old-fashioned but deliberate. He asked about my business, wanting to understand the structure and valuation of Foster Collective. I explained that I had started the firm 2 years before marrying David, that it was my separate property, but that it had grown significantly during our marriage. Richard nodded, already calculating strategies to protect my business assets from being divided. Then he asked the question I had been dreading. He wanted to know if I had any proof of David's infidelity, beyond the financial evidence. Circumstantial evidence and suspicious spending could support a case, but concrete proof would be far more powerful, especially if we ended up in front of a judge who valued traditional marriage. I admitted I did not have concrete proof yet, just patterns that pointed toward an affair. Richard leaned back in his chair and suggested I might want to gather more evidence before filing. He said that in high-asset divorces, information was power, and the more ammunition I had, the stronger my negotiating position would be. Walking out of Richard's office, I felt simultaneously empowered and overwhelmed. I had taken the first real step toward reclaiming my life, but the path ahead looked steep and treacherous. I drove back to Paradise Valley as the afternoon heat baked the city, and I realized I was returning to a house that no longer felt like home. It felt like enemy territory, a place where I had to guard my words and watch my back. David was not there when I arrived, which gave me time to think clearly. I walked through each room, seeing it with new eyes. The custom lighting fixtures I had designed specifically for the high ceilings. The hand-plastered walls, and a technique I had learned from an artisan in Santa Fe. The imported tiles in the master bathroom that I had selected during a trip to Morocco. Every detail represented my vision, my expertise, my investment. And David wanted to claim half of it simply because he had been present while I built it. That realization hardened something inside me. I was not going to let him rewrite history. I was not going to accept Patricia's narrative that I had been a deficient wife who drove her son to stray. I was going to fight for what I had created, and I was going to do it with the same strategic intelligence I brought to designing million-dollar estates. I spent the next week quietly documenting everything. I photographed every room in the house, creating a visual record of the design work that represented my professional expertise. I gathered contracts and invoices showing what I had paid for renovations and improvements. I compiled 8 years of bank statements, organizing them into spreadsheets that showed exactly where our money came from and where it went. The pattern was damning. My income had funded our entire lifestyle, while David's contributions were negligible at best. I also started paying attention to David's movements with more focus. I noted when he left the house and when he returned. I observed his phone habits, the way he tilted the screen away from me when messages arrived, how he had started taking calls in his car rather than inside where I might overhear. I did not confront him, but I watched. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning in early August. David announced he had a golf outing with potential investors, something he claimed would take most of the day. He left the house at 9 wearing athletic clothes and carrying his golf clubs, the picture of innocent recreation. But I had learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts said he was lying. I waited 20 minutes, then followed the tracking app on his phone. I had installed it months ago with his permission, back when we both thought it was a practical safety measure for a married couple. Now it served a different purpose. The app showed his location moving not toward any of the golf courses he frequented, but north toward Carefree, the same area where that boutique hotel charge had appeared on our credit card. I got in my car and drove, keeping enough distance that he would not notice me but close enough to see where he was heading. The route took me out of Paradise Valley, through North Scottsdale, and into the winding roads of Carefree where massive estates sat on acres of pristine desert. David's Range Rover finally pulled into the parking lot of a spa resort I recognized, an exclusive property where memberships cost more annually than most people's salaries. I parked across the street, partially hidden by a cluster of Palo Verde trees, and watched. David emerged from his car looking relaxed, carrying a small overnight bag instead of golf clubs. He walked toward the entrance with the ease of someone who had been there before. And then I saw her. She was younger than me by at least 10 years, with long dark hair and the kind of casual elegance that came from never having to worry about money. She met David at the entrance, rising on her toes to kiss him in a way that left no doubt about their relationship. They walked inside together, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the entrance long after they had disappeared inside. Part of me wanted to storm in there and confront them both. Part of me wanted to drive away and pretend I had never seen it. But the part of me that had built a successful business from nothing, the part that understood strategy and long-term planning, that part knew exactly what to do. I took photographs. I documented the time, the location, the vehicle. I noted the woman's appearance in enough detail to identify her later. Then I drove to a coffee shop and called Richard Brennan's emergency number. When he answered, I told him I had the concrete proof he had asked for. His response was immediate and focused. He told me not to confront David, not to reveal what I knew, and to continue gathering evidence for at least another week. The next 7 days were the hardest of my life. I went through the motions of normalcy, speaking to David with careful neutrality, tolerating Patricia's intrusions without protest, pretending I did not know my husband was maintaining a full affair with another woman while living in the house I paid for. Every smile felt like swallowing glass. Every casual conversation felt like a performance I was giving for an audience of two people who held me in contempt. But I played the role perfectly because I understood that the element of surprise was worth more than immediate satisfaction. I let David think I suspected nothing. I let Patricia believe her son had successfully managed his inconvenient wife. And all the while, I was building a case so airtight that no judge in Arizona would question who deserved to keep the house we lived in. Nicole helped me stay focused during those days. She reminded me that abusers relied on their victims staying isolated and confused. She told me that every day I maintained my composure was a day I grew stronger, and they grew more complacent. She was right. By the end of that week, I felt less like a wounded spouse and more like a general planning a campaign. On the 8th day, I hired a private investigator, a woman named Teresa who specialized in documenting infidelity. I gave her David's schedule, his phone number, and the information about the woman I had seen him with. Teresa was professional and direct. She told me that most cheating spouses followed predictable patterns, and that if I gave her 2 weeks, she would have more than enough evidence to support my case. I agreed, signed her contract, and paid her retainer from my business account. Then I went home and cooked David his favorite dinner, playing the devoted wife one more time while knowing that every performance brought me closer to freedom. Teresa delivered her report on a Thursday afternoon, meeting me at a discreet coffee shop in Central Phoenix where nobody from our social circle would recognize us. She slid a manila envelope across the table with the kind of practiced discretion that told me she had done this hundreds of times before. Inside were photographs that left nothing to interpretation. David and the woman entering hotels together. David and the woman having intimate dinners at restaurants across the valley. David and the woman kissing in parking lots, holding hands on hiking trails, behaving like a couple who had nothing to hide because they assumed no one was watching. Teresa had also identified the woman. Her name was Simone Larkin, 29 years old, recently divorced, working as a yoga instructor at the same country club where Patricia held court like visiting royalty. That detail hit me with particular force. David had met his mistress through his mother's social world, possibly even with Patricia's knowledge or encouragement. The betrayal had layers I was still uncovering. But Teresa had found something even more valuable than photographs. She had discovered that David and Simone had been looking at houses together, touring properties in Paradise Valley and Silverleaf that cost well over $5 million. The real estate agent showing them around had assumed they were married. According to the information Teresa had gathered, David was already planning his next life, one funded by what he expected to take from our divorce. I studied each photograph with clinical detachment, the same way I examined design mock-ups for flaws. These images represented ammunition, evidence that would shift the power dynamic completely. Richard had told me that Arizona recognized fault in divorce proceedings, and that proof of adultery could influence how a judge viewed the division of assets, especially when combined with evidence of financial misconduct. Teresa pulled out a second envelope, this one containing financial records she had obtained through methods I decided not to question too closely. David had opened a separate bank account 4 months ago, one he had never mentioned to me. The account showed regular deposits that did not match his supposed income from the family real estate business. When I asked Teresa where the money was coming from, she pointed to a series of transfers that traced back to Patricia's personal accounts. My mother-in-law had been funding David's affair. She had been giving him money to wine and dine his mistress, to tour expensive houses, to build an exit strategy from our marriage. The revelation sat in my stomach like concrete. This was not just my husband betraying me. This was a coordinated effort by both of them to dismantle my life while keeping me compliant and unsuspecting. I paid Teresa the remainder of her fee and drove home with both envelopes locked in my car safe. The August heat shimmered off the pavement in waves that distorted the horizon, making the familiar landscape look alien and unstable. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat for a moment looking at the house I had created. The architecture was stunning, a masterpiece of desert modernism that had won design awards and been featured in publications that mattered. But it was just a building now, beautiful and empty of the meaning I had tried to pour into it. David's Range Rover was parked in its usual spot, which meant he was home. I gathered my things and walked inside, prepared to perform normalcy one more time. He was in the kitchen, rummaging through the refrigerator with the casual entitlement of someone who had never questioned whether the food inside had appeared by magic or by my careful planning and purchasing. He looked up when I entered and commented that we were out of the expensive aged cheddar he liked. His tone carried a note of complaint, as if I had somehow failed in my duties by not anticipating his snacking needs. I made a non-committal sound and moved past him toward my office, but he stopped me with a question about dinner plans. Patricia wanted us to join her at the country club that evening for what she called a family meeting. The phrase made my skin prickle. Family meeting was Patricia's code for an ambush, a gathering where she would present some new demand or criticism disguised as loving concern. I asked David what the meeting was about, but he waved off the question with irritating vagueness. He said his mother would explain everything, and that I should wear something elegant because important people would be there. I agreed with a smile that felt like it might crack my face. Then I went to my office and called Richard Brennan. I told him about the family meeting, about the financial records Teresa had uncovered, about Patricia's involvement in funding the affair. Richard listened carefully and then gave me advice that felt counterintuitive but strategically sound. He told me to attend the meeting, to observe and document, but to commit to nothing. He said that whatever Patricia had planned, my silence and composure would serve me better than any confrontation. That evening I dressed in a cream silk blouse and tailored pants, the kind of understated elegance that Patricia could not criticize without sounding petty. David wore a suit that I had purchased for him 6 months earlier, looking every bit the successful businessman despite the fact that his most recent contribution to our household finances had been approximately $700 from a consulting fee his father had arranged. We drove to the country club in separate cars because David claimed he might need to leave early for a work call. I knew the real reason was flexibility to see Simone, but I said nothing. The country club sprawled across immaculate grounds, all manicured golf courses in Spanish colonial architecture, designed to evoke old money and established power. Patricia treated the place like her second home, serving on multiple committees and wielding social influence with the precision of a surgeon. She was waiting in a private dining room, dressed in one of her signature St. John suits in pale pink, her jewelry understated but expensive. 2 other people sat with her, A man and woman I did not recognize but whose expensive clothes and confident postures marked them as members of Patricia's wealthy social tier. Patricia introduced them as the Hendersons, longtime family friends and successful real estate investors. The dinner proceeded with excruciating slowness. Course after course of food I barely tasted while Patricia held court. She talked about market conditions, about opportunities in commercial development, about the importance of family legacy and building generational wealth. David participated enthusiastically, displaying a knowledge of real estate trends that he had certainly not acquired through his own minimal work efforts. I played my role, nodding at appropriate moments, asking polite questions, giving Patricia no ammunition to criticize my social performance. But I was watching, noting the way she deferred to Mr. Henderson, observing how the conversation kept circling back to investment opportunities and partnership structures. The trap revealed itself over dessert. Patricia announced, with the kind of bright enthusiasm that made my teeth ache, that the Hendersons were looking for partners in a new luxury development project. She said it was a tremendous opportunity, the kind of investment that could secure David's future and establish him as a serious player in Phoenix real estate. The project required significant capital, she continued, but the returns would be extraordinary for investors willing to commit substantial funds up front. Then she turned to me with that smile that had never been warm. She said that this was exactly the kind of opportunity our family resources should support. She suggested that my business had been quite successful, and that diversifying into real estate investment would be prudent financial planning. She had already discussed it with David, she added, and they both agreed it made excellent sense for me to contribute $500,000 as our share of the investment partnership. The audacity stole my breath. Patricia was sitting in a country club I had paid to join, asking me to hand over $500,000 for a business venture that would primarily benefit her son, all while she was secretly funding his affair with money she apparently had in abundance. David watched me expectantly, and I could see the Hendersons appraising me with the cool assessment of people who had been told I was a source of capital waiting to be tapped. I took a slow sip of water, buying time while my mind raced. Richard's advice echoed in my head. Commit to nothing. Observe and document. I set down my glass with careful precision and told Patricia that it sounded like an interesting opportunity, but that any investment of that magnitude would require thorough due diligence and review by my financial advisors. I said it calmly, pleasantly, giving her nothing to grasp onto. Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She suggested that family should operate on trust rather than excessive caution, that opportunities like this required decisive action, and that my hesitation suggested a lack of faith in David's business judgment. The manipulation was transparent, an attempt to shame me into compliance by questioning my commitment to our marriage. David joined in, his voice taking on an edge I had heard increasingly often in recent months. He said I was always too cautious, too controlling about finances, too unwilling to take the kind of risks that built real wealth. He implied that my success with the design firm had made me arrogant, that I thought I knew better than people with generations of business experience. I looked at him across the table, this man I had supported and funded and believed in, and felt absolutely nothing. The love had drained away so gradually, I had not noticed its absence until this moment. What remained was clarity, cold and sharp as a blade. I told the table that I would review the investment materials and provide an answer within 2 weeks. Then I excused myself, citing an early client meeting the following morning. Patricia's displeasure radiated across the table, but she could not object without appearing unreasonable in front of the Hendersons. David followed me out to the parking lot, his anger no longer contained by the presence of witnesses. He grabbed my arm as I reached my car, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. He told me I had embarrassed him, that I had made him look weak in front of important people, that I needed to stop acting like my money gave me the right to make all our decisions. The physical contact, the presumption of ownership it represented, triggered something primal in me. I pulled my arm free and told him clearly that it was my money, earned by my work, and that I would invest it where and how I chose. His face flushed with rage, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike me there in the country club parking lot. Instead he stepped back and said something that revealed more than he intended. He told me that I had always been difficult, that his mother had warned him I would become a problem, and that maybe it was time we reconsidered whether our marriage was working. The words were meant to frighten me, to make me scramble to apologize and comply. Instead, they confirmed what I already knew. This had been building for a long time, possibly years, and I had been too invested in the illusion of partnership to see the reality. I got in my car without responding and drove home through the desert night. The city lights spread across the valley like a circuit board, beautiful and impersonal. When I reached our house, I did not go inside. Instead, I sat in the driveway and called Richard Brennan's emergency line again. When he answered, I told him everything that had happened at dinner. I described Patricia's investment scheme, David's anger, the physical grab in the parking lot. Richard's response was immediate and unequivocal. He told me to document the bruises on my arm with photographs and timestamps. He said that David had just made a serious tactical error by allowing his mask to slip in a semi-public location, where witnesses might have seen the altercation. He advised me to start preparing for the marriage to end sooner rather than later, and to be ready for it to get uglier before it got better. That night I slept in the guest's bedroom, claiming I had a headache and did not want to disturb David with my restlessness. In truth, I could not bear to share a bed with him anymore. The physical proximity felt like a violation now that I understood how completely he had betrayed every promise we had made to each other. The next morning David was gone before I woke, leaving only a terse text saying he had early meetings. I went through my usual routine on autopilot, preparing for a day of client consultations and design reviews. But my mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios and strategies, calculating how to protect everything I had built. Nicole stopped by the house that afternoon, arriving with Thai takeout and the kind of fierce determination that made her excellent at her job helping abuse survivors. She had asked me to photograph the bruises on my arm, and I showed her the dark purple marks David's fingers had left. She documented them with her phone, taking multiple angles and making notes about the date and circumstances. Then she sat me down and asked the question I had been avoiding. She wanted to know what I was waiting for, what additional proof or permission I needed before I pulled the trigger on divorce. I did not have a good answer. Part of me was still clinging to some fantasy that this could be resolved without destroying everything. Part of me was terrified of the judgment I would face, the whispers at the country club, the satisfaction Patricia would take in my failure. Nicole listened to my rambling justifications and then cut through them with brutal honesty. She told me that I was not protecting a marriage because there was no marriage left to protect. She said I was protecting an image, a performance, a story I told myself about who I was supposed to be. She asked me point blank whether I would advise a client in my situation to stay or leave, and we both knew the answer. That conversation shifted something fundamental. I realized I had been operating from fear, from a desperate desire to avoid conflict and maintain stability, even when that stability was built on lies. But I had not built a successful business by avoiding difficult decisions. I had succeeded by trusting my judgment and acting decisively when situations required it. I called Richard Brennan the following morning and told him I was ready to file for divorce. He scheduled an emergency meeting for that same day. When I arrived at his office, he had already begun drafting the preliminary documents. We spent 3 hours going through every detail, every asset, every claim I would make in the filing. The house was the centerpiece of the case. Richard explained that while Arizona presumed community property division, we could argue for me to retain the house based on several factors. I had paid the entire down payment from premarital funds. I had covered every mortgage payment throughout the marriage. The house represented my professional work as a designer, making it partially a business asset. And most compellingly, I could demonstrate that David had contributed virtually nothing to its acquisition or maintenance. Richard also outlined our strategy regarding the infidelity evidence. We would not lead with it, but hold it in reserve for when David and Patricia inevitably tried to paint me as the problem in the marriage. The photographs, the financial records showing Patricia's funding of the affair, the evidence of David planning a future with Simone while still married to me, all of it would come out at the right moment for maximum impact. We discussed alimony, and Richard's position was firm. Not only would I not be paying David support, but given the disparity in our incomes and his adultery, we could argue that he should be barred from receiving anything beyond his bare minimum share of community assets. The goal was to walk away with the house, my business intact, and my financial future secure. I signed the retainer agreement and authorized Richard to begin preparing the filing. He told me that I should expect David to be served with papers within the next week, and that I should prepare myself for his reaction. He advised me to stay with a friend when the service happened, to avoid being alone with David when he received the news. That evening I packed a bag with essentials and told David I was visiting Nicole for a few days to help her with a project. It was not entirely a lie. Nicole had indeed offered me her guest room for as long as I needed it. David barely looked up from his phone when I mentioned leaving, confirming once again how little my presence mattered to him. I spent the next 5 days at Nicole's house, working remotely and trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine. Richard kept me updated on the filing process. The divorce petition was comprehensive, detailing the asset division I was seeking, the evidence of David's financial misconduct, and my request to retain the marital home based on my sole financial contribution to it. On Tuesday morning, Richard called to tell me the papers had been served. A process server had delivered them to David at his office, catching him off guard in a semi-public setting, where his options for dramatic reaction were limited. Richard said the server reported that David had turned pale when he saw the filing, then immediately got on the phone, presumably calling his mother. I waited for the explosion, but it came from an unexpected direction. That afternoon, Patricia showed up at my design firm's office, bypassing my assistant and barging into my private workspace with the kind of outraged entitlement that would have been comedic if it were not so infuriating. She was vibrating with fury, her carefully maintained composure cracked wide open. She demanded to know how I could do this to her son, how I could be so selfish and vindictive, how I could destroy a marriage over minor disagreements. Her voice rose with each accusation, drawing the attention of my staff in the outer office. I remained seated behind my desk, calm and unmoved, which only seemed to enrage her further. Patricia told me that I was nothing before David married me, that his family's connections had built my business, that I owed everything I had to the Foster name. The lies were so absurd I almost laughed. My business had been thriving before I ever met David. His family's connections had opened exactly 0 doors for me professionally. Every client, every project, every success had come from my own work and reputation. I let her rant herself into exhaustion, and then I spoke with quiet clarity. I told Patricia that her son had committed adultery, that he had stolen from our joint accounts, that he had planned an exit from our marriage while still benefiting from my financial support. I said that I had evidence of all of it, and that if she continued to harass me at my place of business, I would add her conduct to the divorce filing as evidence of a coordinated campaign to exploit and control me. The threat landed with visible impact. Patricia's face drained of color as she realized I was not the compliant daughter-in-law she had bullied for 8 years. I was someone who had done her homework, gathered her evidence, and prepared for war. She left my office without another word. But I knew this was only the opening salvo. That evening David finally called. His voice was tight with controlled rage as he demanded I come home so we could discuss this like adults. I refused, telling him that all communication would go through our attorneys from this point forward. He shifted tactics, trying charm and pleading, reminding me of good times we had shared, suggesting we could work things out through counseling. I let him talk himself out and then asked him directly about Simone Larkin. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When he finally spoke again, the pretense was gone. He said I had been spying on him, that I had violated his privacy, that my controlling behavior had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. The gaslighting was reflexive, automatic, and utterly unconvincing. I told him I would see him in court and ended the call. Then I blocked his number, blocked Patricia's number, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had just set in motion. There was grief there, mourning for the future I had imagined and the partnership I had wanted to build. But underneath the grief was something stronger. It was relief, pure and clean, the kind that came from finally stopping a performance that had been exhausting me for years. The weeks following the divorce filing felt like living in a pressure cooker. Richard had warned me that David and Patricia would escalate their tactics once they realized I was serious, but I had underestimated just how vicious they would become. The attacks started small, passive-aggressive comments through mutual acquaintances, carefully worded social media posts that painted David as a devoted husband blindsided by an ungrateful wife. Patricia worked her network at the country club, spreading a narrative that positioned me as a cold career woman who had neglected her marriage. I ignored the social maneuvering and focused on building my case. Richard had filed a motion for exclusive use of the marital home, arguing that since I had paid for it entirely, I should have the right to live there while the divorce proceeded. The hearing was scheduled for mid-September, and Richard was confident we had the documentation to support our position. In the meantime, I continued staying with Nicole, running my business from her guest room and avoiding any contact with David or his mother. The first major confrontation came 3 weeks after the filing. David showed up at one of my job sites, a multi-million-dollar renovation in Silverleaf where I was overseeing the installation of custom cabinetry. He arrived unannounced, walking past my construction crew with the kind of entitled swagger that suggested he belonged there. I was consulting with the cabinet maker when I looked up to see him standing in the unfinished kitchen, watching me with an expression that mixed anger and something that looked almost like disbelief. He asked to speak privately, and against my better judgment I agreed. We walked out to the empty backyard where foundation work was still underway. David wasted no time launching into his prepared speech. He told me I was being unreasonable, that divorce was too extreme a response to what he called normal marital struggles. He suggested we could work things out if I dropped the filing and agreed to counseling. His tone was conciliatory, almost tender, the version of David I had fallen in love with years ago before Patricia's influence and his own entitlement had warped him into someone unrecognizable. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished I asked him about Simone. I wanted to hear him try to explain it, to see if he had prepared any justification that did not insult my intelligence. His face hardened immediately, the mask of reconciliation dropping away. He said that what happened between him and Simone was none of my business anymore, that I had forfeited the right to ask questions when I filed for divorce. The circular logic would have been funny if it were not so pathetic. I pointed out that he had been seeing Simone for months before I filed, that the affair had preceded and precipitated the divorce, not the other way around. David's response was to pivot to blame. He said I had driven him away with my focus on work, that I had never prioritized our marriage, that I had made him feel like a trophy husband rather than a partner. I felt a surge of anger so intense it made my hands shake. I had funded his entire lifestyle, covered every expense, supported his minimal career while building my own successful business, and now he had the audacity to claim I had not prioritized him enough. I told him exactly that, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I listed every sacrifice I had made, every bill I had paid, every opportunity one had created for him. David's face flushed dark red, and I saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. He stepped closer, invading my space in a way that felt deliberately threatening. He told me I was delusional, that his family's connections had built my business, that everything I had achieved was because of his last name. The lies were so disconnected from reality that I almost pitied him for believing them. But then he said something that revealed the true depth of his contempt. He told me that he had never really loved me, that marrying me had been a practical decision encouraged by his mother, because she thought I would be a useful asset to the family. He said I had served that purpose well enough, but that he deserved better than someone who valued money over relationships. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded, but not in the way he intended. Instead of devastating me, they clarified everything. Our entire marriage had been a transaction for him, and I had been too invested in the fantasy of partnership to see it. I told David to leave my job site and to never approach me again outside the presence of attorneys. When he did not move, I pulled out my phone and called site security. He left then, but not before informing me that I would regret making an enemy of his family. The threat was unsubtle and confirmed what I already suspected. This divorce was going to be a battle, and Patricia would be orchestrating David's strategy every step of the way. That evening I met with Richard to discuss what had happened. He was not surprised by David's behavior, but he was concerned about the veiled threat. He advised me to document any future contact, to vary my routine so I was not predictable, and to consider a restraining order if David continued showing up uninvited. The conversation made the situation feel suddenly more serious, less like a legal proceeding and more like a genuine safety concern. The next escalation came from Patricia directly. She filed a motion to intervene in the divorce, claiming she had a financial interest in the marital home because she had given us money for improvements over the years. The claim was completely fabricated. Patricia had never contributed a single dollar to our house, but Richard explained that her motion was not really about winning. It was about complicating the case, dragging out the proceedings, and increasing my legal costs in hopes I would agree to a settlement just to make it stop. We filed a response challenging her standing to intervene and demanding she provide documentation of any alleged financial contributions. Richard was confident the motion would be denied, but it meant additional hearings, additional preparation, additional time before I could move forward with my life. Patricia was using the legal system as a weapon, and she had the resources to keep swinging it indefinitely. The hearing for exclusive use of the marital home took place on a Thursday morning in late September. The Maricopa County Courthouse was busy with the usual mix of lawyers, litigants, and people navigating the various crises that brought them into the family court system. I dressed in a navy suit that projected professional competence without ostentation, taking Richard's advice to present myself as the reasonable party in contrast to whatever theatrics David might attempt. David arrived with his attorney, a slick-looking man named Preston Morris who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and creative interpretations of community property law. Patricia sat in the gallery behind them, dressed in ivory and radiating righteous maternal concern. I sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with Richard, my evidence binder stacked neatly on the table in front of us. Judge Catherine Morrison presided, a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency and impatience with frivolous arguments. She called our case and asked both sides to present their positions on the motion for exclusive use of the home. Richard went first, laying out the financial evidence with methodical clarity. He presented the documents showing I had paid the $750,000 down payment from my premarital business accounts. He showed 8 years of mortgage statements, every single payment made from accounts funded by my income. He presented renovation invoices, all paid by me, totaling over $300,000 in improvements. Preston Morris objected repeatedly, trying to argue that community property rules meant David had an equal claim regardless of who paid. Judge Morrison allowed him to speak but looked increasingly skeptical as he failed to present any evidence of David's financial contribution to the home. When Richard asked directly whether David had documentation of any payments toward the house, Preston fumbled through his files before admitting that David's contributions had been indirect, through his emotional support and career sacrifices. Judge Morrison actually raised her eyebrows at that response. She asked Preston to clarify what career sacrifices David had made. Given that the evidence showed he worked in his family's business with minimal income, while I built a successful design firm. Preston tried to reframe it as David providing stability and partnership that enabled my career success, but the argument was transparently weak. Then Richard dropped the evidence of the affair. He presented the photographs of David with Simone, the credit card statement showing charges for romantic getaways and jewelry, the bank records proving Patricia had been funding David's separate account. Judge Morrison's expression shifted from skeptical to genuinely displeased as she reviewed the materials. She looked at David directly and asked if he disputed the evidence of infidelity. David started to respond, but Preston cut him off and admitted that while there had been marital difficulties, the question of adultery was not directly relevant to the property use motion. Judge Morrison disagreed. She said that when one spouse had used community funds to conduct an affair while the other spouse was solely supporting the household, it absolutely affected her evaluation of who should have exclusive use of the home during divorce proceedings. Patricia could not contain herself. She stood up from the gallery and addressed the judge directly, saying that her son was being vilified for seeking happiness after years of being controlled and emotionally neglected. Judge Morrison's response was swift and cutting. She told Patricia that she was not a party to the case, that outbursts from the gallery were not permitted, and that if she interrupted again she would be removed from the courtroom. Patricia sat down, her face rigid with suppressed fury. The judge issued her ruling from the bench. She granted me exclusive use of the marital home effective immediately, finding that I had proven sole financial responsibility for the property, and that David's conduct during the marriage supported my request. She ordered David to vacate the premises within 72 hours, and to make arrangements to collect his personal belongings under supervision to prevent any disputes or property damage. The victory was complete and unambiguous. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. Richard was pleased with the outcome, telling me it set a strong precedent for the final asset division. David and Preston left through a different exit, presumably to avoid any confrontation. But Patricia waited for me in the hallway outside the courtroom, her composure restored to its usual brittle perfection. She approached me with a smile that could have cut glass and told me I should enjoy my temporary win while it lasted. She said her family had resources I could not imagine, connections that went deeper than I understood, and that by the time this divorce was finalized I would have nothing left. The threat was delivered in a pleasant conversational tone that made it even more chilling. I did not respond, just walked past her toward the exit where Nicole was waiting to drive me home. That evening I returned to the Paradise Valley house for the first time in weeks. David had apparently been staying there despite my absence, and evidence of his occupancy was everywhere. Dishes piled in the sink, his clothes scattered across our bedroom, the guest bathroom littered with Simone's cosmetics and toiletries. The disrespect was almost impressive in its completeness. He had been bringing his mistress into our home, into the space I had designed and paid for, treating my absence as permission to flaunt his affair. I spent the next 3 days methodically erasing every trace of both of them. I packed David's belongings into boxes and had them delivered to Patricia's house. I threw away everything belonging to Simone, every bottle of shampoo, every piece of makeup, every item that represented her presence in my space. I changed the locks, updated the security system, and reclaimed my home inch by inch. The peace lasted exactly 5 days before the next assault came. Patricia filed a lawsuit separate from the divorce, claiming that I had stolen family heirlooms and valuable artwork that belonged to the Foster estate. The claim was absurd. Every piece of art in the house had been purchased by me, carefully selected to complement the design aesthetic I had created. I had receipts and provenance documentation for everything. But the lawsuit meant more legal fees, more time spent in depositions and hearings, more harassment disguised as legitimate legal action. Richard filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that Patricia's lawsuit was frivolous and aimed solely at harassment. He also began preparing a countersuit for abuse of process and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The legal battle was expanding beyond the divorce itself into a comprehensive war of attrition. Patricia was betting that I would eventually exhaust my resources or my willingness to fight. She had no idea how wrong she was. October brought the worst of it. David's attorney filed a motion demanding I pay temporary spousal support, claiming that David had become accustomed to a certain lifestyle during our marriage and needed support while the divorce was pending. The request was for $15,000 per month, an amount so outrageous it would have been laughable if it were not on official court documents. Preston Morris argued that my income significantly exceeded David's, and that fairness required I maintain him in the manner to which he had grown accustomed. Richard's response was withering. He filed a countermotion with all the evidence of David's affair, the misappropriated community funds, Patricia's financial support of his separate life, and the fact that David had access to family resources he was deliberately concealing. Richard argued that not only should I not pay support, but that David should be ordered to reimburse me for the community funds he had stolen to conduct his affair. The hearing on spousal support was scheduled for early November. In the meantime, I focused on my business and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. My firm had been awarded a major contract to design a boutique hotel in downtown Phoenix, the kind of project that would elevate our reputation even further. I threw myself into the work, using it as both distraction and proof that my success had nothing to do with David or his family's mythical influence. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was a Saturday evening in late October, the temperature finally cooling enough that being outside felt pleasant instead of punishing. I was at the house alone, working on design concepts in my home office when I heard the front gate alert chime. The security camera showed David's Range Rover pulling into the driveway, which should have been impossible since I had revoked his access codes. I watched on the security feed as David got out of his car, followed by Patricia. They walked to the front door and rang the bell with the casual expectation of people who assumed they would be welcomed inside. When I did not answer, David used a key that should not have worked because I had changed the locks. Somehow they had obtained a copy, probably from the original locksmith who installed the system and apparently owed the Foster family some favor. I called 911 immediately, staying on the line while watching them enter my home on the security cameras. The operator instructed me to stay in my office with the door locked until police arrived. I could hear David and Patricia moving through the house, their voices carrying up the stairs. Patricia was directing him to pack up certain items, things she claimed belonged to the family. I heard glass breaking, furniture being moved, the sounds of deliberate destruction. The police arrived within 8 minutes, but the damage was already done. David and Patricia had ransacked my living room, broken several pieces of custom furniture, and attempted to remove artwork from the walls. When the officers entered, Patricia tried to claim she had every right to be there because it was her son's house. The officers were unimpressed, especially when I showed them the court order granting me exclusive use of the property and the security footage of them breaking in with an unauthorized key. David was arrested for criminal trespass and destruction of property. Patricia was detained but ultimately released with a warning because she claimed David had told her they had permission to be there. I gave the police a full statement, provided copies of the security footage, and documented every item they had damaged or attempted to steal. The whole incident was surreal, watching my husband being handcuffed and placed in a police car while his mother argued with officers about the injustice of it all. The criminal charges added a new dimension to the divorce case. Richard immediately filed an emergency motion citing David's conduct as evidence of escalating harassment and potential danger. He requested a restraining order preventing David or Patricia from coming within 500 feet of me or any of my properties. The judge granted a temporary order pending a full hearing, finally creating some legal barrier between me and my abusers. The restraining order hearing took place 2 weeks later, and it was the first time I saw David since his arrest. He looked diminished somehow, the confident swagger replaced by something that resembled desperation. Preston Morris tried to argue that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding, that David had thought he still had the right to access the marital home, that no malicious intent was involved. Judge Morrison was having none of it. She pointed out that David had been explicitly ordered to vacate the premises, that he had received copies of the exclusive use order, and that breaking into a home with the intent to remove property was not a misunderstanding but a crime. She granted the permanent restraining order and warned David that any violation would result in immediate arrest and jail time. She also extended the order to include Patricia after I presented evidence of her role in the break-in and her pattern of harassment. As the hearing concluded, David tried to approach me in the hallway outside the courtroom. He was immediately intercepted by a bailiff who reminded him of the restraining order that had just been issued. David stopped short, but his expression was venomous. He told me across the space between us that I would regret destroying his life, that I had turned into someone cruel and vindictive, that his mother had been right about me all along. I looked at him, this man I had supported and believed in, and felt absolutely nothing but relief that he was finally being held accountable. I turned and walked away without responding, and that small act of dismissal seemed to enrage him more than anything I could have said. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for early December. In the weeks leading up to it, Richard and I prepared our case with meticulous attention to detail. We had financial records documenting every contribution I had made to our life together. We had evidence of David's affair and the community funds he had misappropriated. We had documentation of Patricia's interference and harassment. We had the criminal charges from the break-in. We had everything we needed to ensure I kept the house and emerged from the marriage with my assets protected. David and Preston filed increasingly desperate motions trying to delay the hearing or introduce new arguments, but Judge Morrison denied them all. She had clearly run out of patience with their tactics and was ready to bring the case to conclusion. The final hearing would be comprehensive, covering property division, spousal support, and all remaining contested issues in a single day-long session. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear, unusual weather for Phoenix even in December. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit and met Richard at the courthouse 2 hours early to review our presentation one final time. He was confident but cautioned me not to assume anything until the judge issued her ruling. Family court could be unpredictable, he reminded me, and judges sometimes made decisions based on factors that were not apparent to the parties involved. David arrived with Preston, and I was struck by how much older he looked than he had just 4 months earlier when this all began. The stress was written clearly on his face, and I wondered if he had finally realized the magnitude of what he had lost. Patricia was conspicuously absent, presumably barred from attending by the restraining order, though I had no doubt she was waiting by her phone for updates. Judge Morrison called our case and asked both sides if they were prepared to proceed. When we confirmed we were, she indicated that she had reviewed all the submitted materials and had some preliminary questions. She asked David directly about the community funds that had been used for his affair, wanting to hear his explanation in his own words. David fumbled through a response that essentially amounted to claiming he deserved to spend community money. However, he wanted because it was half his regardless of where it came from. Judge Morrison's expression made clear what she thought of that argument. She then asked him about his current income and his ability to support himself post-divorce. Preston jumped in to argue that David's income was limited through no fault of his own, that the divorce had damaged his professional reputation, and that he needed support to reestablish himself. Richard countered with evidence of the job offer David had waiting at Patricia's company, a position that would pay him substantially more than he had earned during our marriage. Preston had apparently not known about that offer, and the surprise on his face was almost comical. Judge Morrison then turned to the issue of the house. She asked David what financial contribution he had made to the acquisition or maintenance of the property. Preston tried to argue again about indirect contributions and emotional support, but the judge cut him off. She wanted specifics, numbers, evidence of actual financial investment. When Preston could not provide any, she moved on. The hearing lasted 6 hours, breaking only once for lunch. Both sides presented their arguments, their evidence, their witnesses. I testified about the years of financial support I had provided, the business I had built, the home I had created. David testified about feeling controlled and unappreciated, about his mother's concerns for his well-being, about his belief that he deserved half of everything regardless of who had paid for it. When all the evidence was presented and all the arguments made, Judge Morrison took a 30-minute recess to review her notes and prepare her ruling. Those 30 minutes felt like hours. I sat with Richard in the hallway, too nervous to speak, while David and Preston conferred in worried whispers across the corridor. Finally, we were called back into the courtroom. Judge Morrison began by noting that this was one of the clearer cases she had seen in terms of disproportionate financial contribution to a marriage. She said that while Arizona law presumed equal division of community property, that presumption could be overcome when one spouse could demonstrate sole financial responsibility for assets, and when the other spouse had engaged in waste of community funds. She ruled that I would retain sole ownership of the marital home, citing my complete financial responsibility for its purchase and maintenance. She found that David had wasted community assets through his affair, and ordered him to reimburse me $50,000 for those expenditures. She denied his request for spousal support entirely, finding that he had access to family resources and employment opportunities that made support unnecessary and inappropriate, given his conduct during the marriage. She divided the remaining community assets roughly 60-40 in my favor, accounting for the fact that most of those assets had been acquired through my income. She ordered David to pay half of my attorney fees, finding that his litigation tactics and the break-in had unnecessarily complicated and extended the proceedings. The total amount he owed me, between the reimbursement and the attorney fees, came to over $100,000. The ruling was comprehensive and devastating to David's case. I watched him absorb each point, his face growing paler with every sentence the judge spoke. When she finished, she asked if either party wanted to state anything for the record. Preston wisely declined. Richard thanked the court for its careful consideration of the evidence. Judge Morrison signed the final decree and declared our marriage dissolved. 8 years of my life, 8 years of sacrifice and support and misplaced faith, ended with the stroke of a pen. I felt simultaneous relief and grief, freedom and loss, vindication and exhaustion. David left the courtroom without looking at me, Preston following behind carrying boxes of documents that had failed to make any difference. Richard shook my hand and congratulated me on the outcome. He said it was one of the most clear-cut victories he had seen in a high-asset divorce case, and that David and Patricia's overreach had ultimately worked in my favor by showing the court exactly who they were. I thanked him for his representation, paid his final invoice, and walked out of the Maricopa County Courthouse a divorced woman with sole ownership of a $7.5 million mansion. The December sun was setting as I drove back to Paradise Valley, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold. I pulled into my driveway, my house rising before me in all its architectural beauty, and I finally understood that it had never been about the building itself. It was about what the house represented. My vision, my work, my refusal to let people who had contributed nothing take what I had built. I walked through rooms that were finally completely mine. No more Patricia rearranging my furniture. No more David using my money to fund his betrayal. No more pretending that sacrifice and servitude were the same thing as partnership. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if removing their presence had cleared space for something new. The months that followed were about rebuilding in ways I had not anticipated. My business thrived, winning awards and major contracts that established Foster Collective as one of the premier design firms in the Southwest. I renovated parts of the house, erasing the last traces of David's occupancy and creating spaces that reflected only my aesthetic vision. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during the years of trying to please Patricia and manage David's demands. I heard through mutual acquaintances that David married Simone in a small ceremony 6 months after our divorce was finalized. They moved into a modest house in Tempe, far from the Paradise Valley luxury he had grown accustomed to. Patricia apparently blamed Simone for not being the meal ticket I had been, and the relationship between David and his mother had become strained now that he could not provide her with access to my resources. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, but I also felt no regret for the boundaries I had enforced. The divorce had cost me time, money, and emotional energy I would never recover. But it had also taught me something invaluable about my own strength and my refusal to accept mistreatment even when it came wrapped in the language of family and obligation. Nicole told me months later that she had been terrified I would back down, that the pressure from David and Patricia would convince me to accept less than I deserved. She said watching me fight for myself had been inspiring, proof that even when the system seemed designed to favor men like David with their family money and social connections, documentation and determination could still win. On a warm evening in late spring, almost a year after the divorce was finalized, I stood on my terrace watching the sun set over the mountains. The fountain I had designed years ago still played in the courtyard, water dancing over stone in patterns I had sketched when I still believed in the future David and I were supposedly building together. But the sound no longer carried the weight of broken promises. It was just beautiful, just mine, just exactly what I had envisioned when I created it. My phone buzzed with a message from a potential client, someone who had seen my work featured in a design magazine and wanted to discuss a major project in Sedona. I responded with my availability, feeling the familiar thrill of a new creative challenge. This was the life I had actually built, not the fantasy I had tried to force into existence through sheer will and financial support. The house stood solid around me, every line and surface, a testament to vision that had always been mine alone. David had wanted to claim half of it simply for being present while I worked. Patricia had wanted to control it as an extension of her family's territory. But the $7.5 million mansion belonged to me, not because a judge had ruled in my favor, but because I had never stopped fighting for what I knew was true. I had paid for every brick, every window, every carefully selected detail. I had designed it, built it, and ultimately defended it against people who mistook my generosity for weakness. And now, standing in the home that was finally and completely my own, I understood that the real victory had nothing to do with real estate or money. The victory was knowing that I would never again accept being erased, diminished, or rewritten by people who contributed nothing but demanded everything. The victory was walking away from a marriage that had become a prison, and into a future where every choice reflected my own values and vision. The victory was learning that strength sometimes looked like saying no, walking away, and refusing to compromise on the truth of your own worth. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of creosote and the promise of summer heat to come. I turned from the terrace and walked back inside my house, ready for whatever came next, knowing that whatever it was, I would face it standing on ground I had claimed entirely on my own terms. The years that followed my divorce from David unfolded with a clarity I had not experienced during our marriage. There was no longer any fog of confusion, no second-guessing my perceptions, no wondering if I was being unreasonable when I set boundaries or made decisions about my own life. The house in Paradise Valley became more than just a residence or a symbol of what I had fought to keep. It became a laboratory for the kind of life I wanted to build when nobody else's expectations were weighing down every choice. I started by making changes that were purely for me, alterations that had nothing to do with resale value or design trends, or what clients might want to see in my portfolio. I converted one of the guest bedrooms into a reading room, lining the walls with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and installing a window seat that overlooked the desert landscape. I filled those shelves with novels I had been meaning to read for years, art books I had collected but never had time to properly examine, and design monographs that inspired me but served no practical business purpose. The kitchen, which had always been a showpiece designed to impress rather than to actually cook in, got a complete overhaul. I ripped out the Italian marble countertops that David had insisted looked elegant but were impractical for real cooking. I replaced them with butcher block and soapstone, surfaces that would age and patina with use rather than remaining pristine and untouched. I installed a proper range with enough BTUs to handle serious cooking, and I learned to make dishes that took time and attention, meals that were about the pleasure of creating rather than the performance of hosting. My business continued to grow in ways that validated every risk I had taken. The boutique hotel project in downtown Phoenix was completed to significant acclaim, winning a regional design award and generating a wave of new client inquiries. I hired 2 additional designers to handle the increased workload, carefully selecting people who shared my aesthetic sensibility, but brought their own perspectives and creativity to the firm. Foster Collective was becoming something larger than just my individual work, evolving into a collaborative practice with a distinct point of view. One of my new hires was a young woman named Jasmine Chan, who had recently graduated from the design program at Arizona State University. She had a portfolio that demonstrated remarkable spatial intuition and a willingness to push boundaries in ways that reminded me of my younger self. During her interview, she had asked me directly about the divorce that had been covered extensively in local society pages, wanting to know if the personal turmoil had affected my creative work. I appreciated the directness of the question rather than the whispered speculation I had endured from others. I told her that the divorce had actually clarified my creative vision by removing the constant pressure to compromise my aesthetic choices to accommodate someone else's ideas about what was appropriate or impressive. I said that the best work I had ever done came in the 2 years since becoming solely responsible for my own decisions. Jasmine nodded with understanding that suggested she had her own experiences with having to fight for her voice in spaces that wanted to diminish it. The social fallout from the divorce had been significant but not as devastating as I had feared. Patricia's campaign to paint me as a cold career woman who had driven her devoted son away had found some receptive audiences, particularly among the old guard at the country club who shared her traditional views about women's roles and family obligations. But I discovered that I did not actually care about the opinions of people who would believe Patricia's version of events without question. What surprised me was how many people quietly reached out with support. Women I had known casually through business or social functions sent messages sharing their own stories of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and the difficulty of leaving marriages where they were expected to fund lifestyles while receiving no appreciation or partnership in return. Several of them became genuine friends, relationships built on mutual respect and understanding, rather than social proximity or business networking. One of these women was Elena Vasquez, an attorney who specialized in estate planning and had hired me to design her home office. During our consultations, we had discovered an easy rapport that extended beyond the professional. Elena was divorced herself, having left a marriage where her physician husband had expected her to subordinate her career to his schedule and priorities, while contributing equally to household finances. She understood viscerally the dynamics I had escaped, and our conversations became a kind of mutual therapy where we could laugh about the absurdity of men who wanted the financial benefits of a partnership without any of the actual equality. Through Elena, I met other women who had built successful careers and businesses, women who had refused to shrink themselves to accommodate partners who felt threatened by their success. We formed an informal group that met monthly for dinner, gathering at different restaurants around the valley to share food and stories and strategies for navigating a world that still expected women to be simultaneously ambitious and deferential, successful and modest, financially independent and relationship-focused. These gatherings became one of the highlights of my monthly calendar, spaces where I could be completely honest about the challenges and triumphs of my life without worrying about judgment or misunderstanding. When I mentioned struggling with the loneliness of living alone in a large house after years of cohabitation, nobody suggested I needed to find a new partner to fill the space. Instead, they shared their own experiences of learning to value solitude, to distinguish between loneliness and simply being alone, to create lives rich enough that romantic partnership was optional rather than necessary. My relationship with Nicole deepened as well, moving beyond the crisis support she had provided during the divorce into a friendship of genuine equals. She had been promoted to director of her victim advocacy program, and her work continued to illuminate the patterns of abuse that often went unrecognized because they did not involve physical violence. We had long conversations about the ways financial control and emotional manipulation operated in relationships, how abusers leveraged social expectations about marriage and family to maintain power over their victims. Nicole told me that my case had actually become a teaching example in some of her training programs, obviously anonymized but used to illustrate how financial abuse could exist even in relationships that appeared successful and stable from the outside. She said that many people did not recognize that paying for everything while receiving no appreciation or autonomy was a form of exploitation, that they internalized narratives about partnership and sacrifice that prevented them from seeing the imbalance clearly. Hearing my experience used to help others gave me a sense of purpose beyond my own healing. If my willingness to fight back against David and Patricia could provide a roadmap for someone else trapped in a similar dynamic, then all the difficulty and expense and emotional exhaustion of the divorce had served a purpose larger than just my individual liberation. The second year after my divorce brought unexpected professional opportunities that expanded my work in new directions. I was invited to speak at a design conference in Los Angeles about creating residential spaces that reflected authentic client needs, rather than aspirational images from magazines and social media. The talk forced me to articulate ideas that had been forming gradually through my own experience, thoughts about how design could either support or undermine the way people actually wanted to live. I argued that too much residential design was about creating spaces for performance rather than genuine living, rooms arranged to impress visitors, rather than to support the daily rhythms and activities of the people who occupied them. I talked about the years I had spent designing my Paradise Valley house to meet some imagined standard of what a successful home should look like, and how I had only begun to make it truly mine after the divorce when I finally asked what I actually needed and wanted from my living space rather than what would look impressive or meet someone else's expectations. The response to the talk was overwhelming. I received dozens of emails from designers and homeowners who resonated with the ideas, who shared their own experiences of creating or living in beautiful spaces that somehow felt empty or constraining. Several publications reached out asking me to expand the talk into articles or essays. A literary agent contacted me suggesting I write a book about design philosophy and the relationship between physical spaces and authentic living. The book idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. I had never considered myself a writer beyond the technical documentation and client communications required for my work. But the agent, a sharp woman named Marissa Bloom based in New York, argued that my perspective was valuable precisely because it came from lived experience rather than academic theory. She said the design world needed voices that could bridge the gap between high-end professional practice and the real questions ordinary people had about creating homes that actually supported their lives. I spent 6 months developing a book proposal, working with Marissa to articulate the core arguments and outline chapters that would balance design principles with personal narrative. The process forced me to examine my own story with more rigor and honesty than I had previously attempted, to understand not just what had happened in my marriage but why I had tolerated the imbalance for so long before finally recognizing it as abuse. Writing about those years was difficult in unexpected ways. I had to confront my own complicity in maintaining the fiction of partnership, acknowledge the ways I had rationalized David's behavior, and dismissed my own doubts because I was invested in a particular narrative about who I was and what my marriage meant. I had to admit that my success in business had made it easier to ignore the failure of my personal relationship, that I had used work as both refuge and excuse to avoid facing problems that were apparent if I had been willing to look at them clearly. But the writing process was also liberating, an opportunity to reclaim my story from the versions David and Patricia had tried to impose. I could be honest about my mistakes and my growth without having anyone else's interpretation layered over my own experience. The book proposal evolved into something I was genuinely proud of, a blend of design wisdom and personal memoir that I hoped would resonate with readers navigating their own questions about homes and lives and authentic self-expression. Marissa sold the book to a major publisher in a deal that included a substantial advance and marketing support. The contract signing felt like validation of a different kind than my design awards, recognition that my voice and perspective had value beyond my professional expertise. The book was scheduled for publication 18 months later, which gave me time to actually write it while continuing to run my business and take on new projects. During this period of professional expansion, I also began dating again, cautiously and with none of the urgency I might have felt when I was younger. I had no interest in replacing David or finding someone to fill a void in my life. I was dating out of curiosity, wondering what romantic connection might feel like when I approached it from a position of genuine independence, rather than seeking partnership to complete some imagined version of adult success. The first few attempts were awkward and ultimately uninteresting. Dinner dates with men who seemed pleasant enough but with whom I felt no real spark or connection. I discovered that I had developed a low tolerance for certain behaviors that I might have overlooked in the past, immediate deal breakers that included any hint of financial entitlement, any expectation that I should rearrange my schedule or priorities to accommodate their convenience, any suggestion that my success was intimidating or needed to be downplayed for their comfort. Elena laughed when I described my rapidly expanding list of dating deal breakers, but she understood the impulse. She said that once you had extricated yourself from a relationship where you consistently compromised your own needs and boundaries, it became much harder to tolerate even minor versions of that dynamic. She called it having a recalibrated bullshit detector, a refined ability to spot red flags that you might have previously rationalized or ignored. I met Marcus Rivera at a fundraiser for an arts education nonprofit, a low-pressure environment where I attended primarily to support the cause rather than with any expectation of meeting someone. He was an architect who specialized in sustainable affordable housing, work that was both technically challenging and deeply values-driven. We ended up in a conversation about the ethics of design in an industry that often prioritized luxury and exclusivity over accessibility and community benefit. Marcus had opinions I did not entirely agree with, but he argued them with intellectual honesty and genuine curiosity about perspectives different from his own. He asked about my work without the subtle condescension I had learned to expect from men in adjacent fields, genuinely interested in my design philosophy rather than trying to demonstrate his own expertise. When the fundraiser ended, he asked if I would be interested in continuing the conversation over coffee sometime, and I surprised myself by immediately saying yes. Our first official date stretched from coffee into lunch, and then a walk through the desert botanical garden, conversation flowing easily across topics that ranged from architecture and design to books and travel, and the particular challenges of building a creative practice in a place like Phoenix where the cultural infrastructure sometimes felt inadequate to the region's growing population and economic significance. Marcus told me about his own divorce several years earlier, a relatively amicable split from a woman he had married young before either of them had figured out who they actually were or what they wanted from life. He spoke about the experience with reflective honesty rather than bitterness, acknowledging his own mistakes and growth without dwelling in regret. I appreciated the maturity of that perspective, so different from David's tendency to blame everyone else for any difficulties in his life. Over the following months, Marcus and I developed a relationship that felt fundamentally different from my marriage to David. We maintained separate lives and separate homes, coming together for dinners and outings and occasional weekends, but with no assumption that we needed to merge our existences or compromise our individual priorities. Marcus respected my work schedule and my need for solitude, never pressuring me to sacrifice professional opportunities or personal time to prove my commitment to the relationship. What struck me most was how easy it felt to be honest with Marcus about my needs and boundaries. When he suggested a weekend trip that conflicted with a major client deadline, I said no without guilt or elaborate justification, and he simply adjusted the plans without making me feel bad about it. When I told him I was not ready to introduce him to my broader friend group because I wanted to keep the relationship somewhat private while I figured out how I felt about it, he understood without taking it as rejection. The contrast with David was stark and illuminating. I realized that so much of my previous marriage had involved managing David's reactions to my choices, carefully calibrating my decisions to minimize his disappointment or disapproval, constantly negotiating for the right to prioritize my own needs. With Marcus, I could simply state what I wanted or needed, and he either agreed or we found a compromise that worked for both of us, no drama or manipulation required. I did not know if the relationship with Marcus would become something long-term and significant, but I also did not feel pressured to figure that out on any particular timeline. I was enjoying the connection for what it was in the present rather than trying to force it into some predetermined narrative about what a successful relationship should look like. The freedom to simply experience the relationship without constantly evaluating it against external standards felt like yet another dividend of the work I had done to reclaim my life from David and Patricia's control. The house in Paradise Valley continued to evolve as I made additional changes that reflected my developing sense of what I actually wanted from my living space. I converted the formal dining room into a design studio, installing drafting tables and material libraries, and pin-up boards where I could work on projects at home when I wanted the solitude and focus my office sometimes lacked. The room had always felt like wasted space, a ceremonial area that existed only for the occasional dinner party Patricia insisted we host, and transforming it into functional workspace felt like a perfect metaphor for the larger changes in my life. I also made peace with the size of the house, accepting that I did not need to fill every room with activity or justify the square footage to anyone. Some spaces remained relatively empty, intentionally minimal in a way that felt restful rather than incomplete. I had spent so many years trying to create a home that looked occupied and lived in to meet some external standard, and now I allowed the house to have empty spaces that served no purpose beyond providing visual calm and room to breathe. Friends occasionally asked if I ever regretted fighting so hard to keep the house, whether a smaller, more manageable property might have been easier after the divorce. I understood the logic of the question, but my answer was always no. The house represented something irreplaceable, not because of its monetary value or even its design quality, but because it was the physical embodiment of my refusal to be erased or diminished. Keeping it meant something beyond the practical considerations of square footage and maintenance costs. 3 years after my divorce, I received an unexpected message through my business website. The sender identified herself as Simone Larkin, David's wife, and she was requesting a consultation for a design project. My immediate instinct was to delete the message and block the sender, wanting nothing to do with anyone connected to that chapter of my life. But curiosity got the better of me, and I read the entire message before deciding how to respond. Simone wrote that she understood I might not want to work with her given the history, but that she had followed my career for years and genuinely admired my design work. She said she was in the process of divorcing David herself after discovering that he had been having another affair, and that she finally understood what I must have experienced. She was not asking for forgiveness or trying to establish any personal connection, she wrote, but simply requesting the opportunity to hire me for my professional expertise if I was willing. I sat with the message for several days before responding. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated that David had repeated the same patterns with his second wife, proving that the problem had never been about my inadequacy or his mother's mythical concerns about my priorities. But vindication felt hollow and small. What I actually felt was a complicated mixture of empathy for what Simone was experiencing and a reluctance to become involved even tangentially with anything connected to David. I ultimately responded with professional courtesy, thanking her for reaching out, but explaining that I did not take on projects where there was potential for personal complications to interfere with the working relationship. I referred her to 2 other excellent designers in the area who could serve her needs, and I wished her well in her divorce. Her response was gracious and understanding, thanking me for the referrals and saying she hoped I knew how inspiring my example had been. The exchange left me thoughtful about the ripples of my choices, the ways my refusal to accept mistreatment had apparently resonated with someone I had once viewed as complicit in my betrayal. I would never know the full story of what had happened between David and Simone, whether she had knowingly participated in his deception or been deceived herself, but her message suggested she had her own difficult learning to do. I heard through the Phoenix social network that David's situation had continued to deteriorate after his second divorce. His mother had apparently withdrawn much of her financial support after he failed to secure another wealthy wife who could fund his lifestyle. His work in the family real estate business had become tenuous as Patricia aged and began transferring control to other family members who were less indulgent of David's minimal contributions. The last I heard, he was living in a modest apartment in Tempe and working in property management, a significant fall from the Paradise Valley luxury he had taken for granted during our marriage. I felt no satisfaction in his struggles, but I also felt no guilt. David had made his choices, repeatedly prioritizing his own comfort and ego over honesty and respect, and he was now living with the consequences of those choices. My responsibility had been to protect myself and my assets from his exploitation, not to continue subsidizing a lifestyle he had no intention of earning or appreciating. Patricia's fate was somewhat different. She remained socially prominent in certain Scottsdale circles, still serving on her committees and hosting her events, but her influence had waned as younger, more progressive leadership emerged in the organization she had once dominated. I occasionally saw her at charity functions or community events, always impeccably dressed and maintaining her facade of gracious dignity, but we never spoke or acknowledged each other. The restraining order had long since expired, but the social boundary remained absolute. My book was published to respectful reviews and solid sales, finding an audience among both design professionals and general readers interested in the intersection of physical spaces and authentic living. Several reviewers specifically mentioned the personal narrative sections, noting that my willingness to examine my own experiences with honesty and vulnerability made the design philosophy more accessible and compelling. I did a modest book tour, speaking at bookstores and design schools, and discovered that I enjoyed the public speaking more than I had anticipated. One of the most gratifying outcomes of the book was hearing from readers who saw their own experiences reflected in my story. I received letters and emails from women who had been in similar situations, supporting partners financially while receiving no appreciation or autonomy, struggling with the guilt of wanting more from relationships that looked successful from the outside. Several of them told me that reading about my divorce had given them permission to acknowledge their own unhappiness and start taking steps to change their situations. There was something profound about learning that my willingness to leave and fight for what I deserved had created space for other women to consider their own options. It reminded me that our individual choices ripple outward in ways we cannot always predict or control, that standing up for yourself can be a political act with implications beyond your personal circumstances. 5 years after my divorce, I stood once again on the terrace of my Paradise Valley home, this time with a glass of wine and a sense of peace that felt earned rather than imposed. The desert stretched away toward the mountains, the same view I had looked at for years but somehow more vivid now, more real, as if I was finally seeing it clearly rather than through the filter of performing a life for someone else's approval. The house was hosting its first significant gathering since I had reclaimed it, a celebration for the opening of Foster Collective's second office location in Tucson. My team was scattered throughout the space, along with clients and collaborators and friends, all of them people I had chosen to include in my life, rather than people I was obligated to impress. Nicole was there with her partner, Elena had brought her teenage daughter who was interested in design, Marcus was helping in the kitchen with a casual ease that spoke to how integrated he had become in my life without demanding to control it. I watched people move through the rooms I had designed, seeing them appreciate the spaces not as a showpiece, but as a beautiful functional environment that supported genuine connection and celebration. This was what I had been trying to create all along. I realized, not a monument to success or status, but a home that felt true to who I was and what I valued. Someone called my name from inside, and I turned to see Jasmine waving me over to meet a potential client who was interested in discussing a major renovation. I took a last look at the desert view, this landscape that had witnessed my transformation from a woman who accepted being erased to someone who understood her own value deeply enough to defend it, and then I went inside to engage with the life I had built on my own terms. The $7.5 million mansion was never really about the money or even the architecture. It was about refusing to accept a narrative that erased my contributions and dismissed my worth. It was about understanding that generosity stops being virtuous when it becomes self-destruction, that partnership requires mutual respect and recognition, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to accept less than you deserve. David had wanted me to fund his lifestyle and accept his contempt, to be simultaneously indispensable and invisible. Patricia had wanted me to subordinate myself to her son's needs while she maintained control over both of us. And I had said no. That simple refusal, backed by evidence and determination and a willingness to endure temporary difficulty for long-term freedom, had changed everything. The house remained standing as proof that I had been here, that I had created something valuable, that I had refused to let people who contributed nothing take what I had built. And every day I walked through its rooms, I was reminded that the most important victory was not keeping the physical structure, but reclaiming the right to define my own worth and live according to my own values. The party continued around me, laughter and conversation filling spaces that had once felt oppressive with tension and unspoken resentments. This was what freedom looked like, I thought. Not the absence of connection or obligation, but the presence of relationships built on honesty and mutual respect. This was what I had been fighting for all along, even when I did not have words for it. As the evening progressed and guests began to filter out into the desert night, I found myself once more on the terrace, this time with Elena and Nicole beside me. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights spread across the valley, three women who had all fought their own battles for autonomy and dignity and won, not because we were exceptional but because we had refused to accept narratives that diminished our worth. Elena raised her glass in an impromptu toast. "To surviving," she said simply. Nicole and I clinked our glasses against hers, and I added my own addendum. "To more than surviving," I said. "To actually living." We drank to that, to lives reclaimed and futures built on our own terms, to the understanding that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply insisting on your own value when everyone around you is invested in denying it. The night air was cool and perfect, carrying the scent of desert flowers and possibility, and I stood in the home I had fought to keep, surrounded by people I had chosen, living a life I had built deliberately and consciously, and I knew with absolute certainty that every difficult moment had been worth it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.